Hello everyone and welcome to Clay to Canopy. Today I'm going to be talking about bent lamination, and I'm actually going to do a brief demo of how to do a bend. But before we can get into that, let's talk about why we do bent lamination in the first place. If you want to make something that's bent and you want to curve the piece of wood, you can't just take a solid piece of wood and cut out a curve. But what ends up happening is if you go in to try and cut this out on this curve, you end up with a bunch of grain running this way. This is the direction that the grain would be running in. And this little area here where the bend will be very vulnerable to breakage. So cutting just a solid piece of wood to get this kind of curve is not really the best way to go, especially if it's something that's going to be like a table leg. Obviously it's way too extreme for a table leg. But if you were making something curved that was supposed to be a table leg or something functioning, you want it to last a really long time, and you're doing yourself no favors if you start off with something that's already going to be structurally an issue. So you don't want to do it out of solid wood. The other options that you're left with then is going to be either to steam bend or do a process called bent lamination. The reason why I don't steam bend is steam bending is a process where you have box chamber that you pump steam through. You'll take a solid chunk of wood that goes into the steam chamber. It takes a long time for it to heat up and the steam to actually open up the fibers of a piece of wood in order for it to be pliable. And then you'll need a jig that you're going to be putting the object on, and a team of pretty burly people to come in and bend the bend with you, because it's not something that you can do with just one person unless it's a really tiny bend. And if you're trying to do something that's for like a chair leg or something, you need a lot of muscle, and you have about 30 seconds to make the bend happen before the pores start closing up. So yes, it's an insanely quick process that you need a team of people to do in order to do steam bending. And then on top of that, if you're in a place like me, like here in California, where it's kind of crazy weather, where it goes from really humid to like insanely dry all at once, that kind of weather will wreak havoc on wood. And what will end up happening is over time, the piece that you steam bent will actually begin to warp and change, and the bend itself will lose its structure. Because I don't have a team of burly people waiting around to do my bending, I lean towards a process called bent lamination. And that process is where you take a bunch of thin pieces of veneer wood and you apply some glue, goes onto a form, and then you glue it up, and pretty much you can do this on your own. You don't need a team. It doesn't take a lot of effort, and you have a lot more open work time depending on the glue that you go with. There's not too much of a stress of, oh, I gotta get this bend done in 30 seconds, right? So what exactly do you use for the bent lamination? If you want to do is you're going to purchase some veneer, and what veneer is very thin cuts of wood. It's a little bit thicker than paper, and veneer can come in multiple different types. So you can get, this one's a maple, and I have some exotics here. Obviously, the more exotic the wood, the more expensive it is. They also sell the veneer in different thicknesses. The thinner the veneer is going to be, the more pliable your piece is going to be. The deeper the curve and arc you can get if the veneer is thinner. So this veneer is just standard veneer, which is usually about 1/42. What that means is that I need 42 little strips of veneer before I make 1 full inch. So that's a lot of little layers. If you're doing just a subtle curve, you don't want to be dealing with 42 little layers of veneer if you're making like a 1 inch thick bend. So for something that's really going to be a subtle curve, maybe you want to opt for the thicker veneer. Let's say you went with 1/16. 1/16 is not going to lend you to getting really drastic curves, but you can get nice subtle bends with a 1/16 when you will only need 16 pieces to get to an inch. So depending on how thick you want your veneers to be and how subtle you want your curve or how drastic you want your curve is going to depend on how thick you order your veneer. These veneers here that I have are unbacked veneer, which means that they are raw. They have nothing on the backs of them, just the sheet of wood by itself. Here in California though, it is very hard for me to find unbacked veneer. The shops tend to have something that is going to either have an adhesive back already, which is this stuff here, or it's going to be backed with something like an MDF or another sub backing. Having the backing for them and whatever they're using it for, mostly to veneer on tabletops and things like that. They don't care about the adhesive, and that's great. But for the sake of bending wood, you don't want something that's going to be either backed with MDF or have an adhesive. you're going to be applying your own adhesive, but also if the piece was backed with some kind of MDF, you'd see that in the laminations. So the goal of a good bend is to make it look like it was one solid piece of wood. So you don't want this stuff, you don't want the adhesive back, and you don't want anything that's going to have a substrate. You want to get raw veneer, and I can put a link to the source that I use. They are not sponsoring me, it's just a source that I was able to find and I've been using for some time now. I actually lived in upstate New York where the source that I use is located, and I just continue to use them because I'm familiar with them. If you are from California and you know where I can get some raw veneer, please let me know. That would be awesome. Now, once you have your veneer, you need to figure out how you're going to go about cutting your pieces to get them ready for actual bend. You might think, oh, I can just cut it on my bandsaw. I've done that before. Depending on how thick the veneer is, for the most part, this paper thin stuff, you don't want to cut on the bandsaw. Cutting the paper thin stuff on the bandsaw is a nightmare. You end up with a bunch of jagged edges. That's if you're lucky enough to not completely tear the veneer before you actually get a cut going. Some other options you can use is a rotary cutter, and just a setup that you would normally use for fabric. I have a cutting mat here, a rotary cutter, and a fabric ruler. But this is not always the best thing because sometimes the blade will find the run of the grain and you'll end up with some wonky cuts. It all also can chip and whatnot. For the most part, I will use just a pencil to mark out where my lines are and a pair of regular scissors that are nice and sharp, and just cut them with some scissors until I cut up my bundled strips. The scissors, for some reason, just give me more control. I don't know if it's just a personal preference. Maybe you're gonna find that actually the rotary cutter gives you more control. For me, I go in and I prep and bundle them depending on how thick I want the bend to go. These are all in bundles for 2 bends at a time because I was working with 2 jigs at a time. And also what I have done here is this is actually mahogany on the outside and maple in the center. And because of what I'm going to be using this for, you're not actually going to view inside here. You'll see this edge, and to save a little bit of money, what I have done is I've used the maple that I got at a really great price, and I've saved the exotic woods to go onto the outside just for where it's going to be visible. You most certainly can go ahead and do all of your layers of the same wood. If it is going to be domestic wood, it's going to be much cheaper. Checking off my list here, glues. All right, let's talk about glue. I have this epoxy and just basic Titebond 2, and I used to use some stuff that was called Unibond, which is similar to this epoxy. It's very rigid, very gnarly stuff. It's really cheap though. So the benefit of using something like the Unibond or the epoxy is that it's a much more rigid glue. It is a chemical reaction, and you'll have a part A and a part B, and you mix the two together, and as you mix the two together, you end up with a chemical reaction that then holds your bond together, which is very different from something like your Titebond or your basic wood glue, where these dry based off of the air. So they need air to circulate and air to dry to do its actual curing. Why does that matter? Well, in some cases you might be doing a glue up where you're using a vacuum bag. If you're using a vacuum bag, you're not going to be able to use a glue that is going to need air to cure it, because the whole point of a vacuum bag is to suck all of the air out of the bag in order to do the actual glue up. So this is going to be no good to you. You're going to have to switch off to either the epoxy or the Unibond. And the epoxy is not cheap. This was, I think, somewhere about 100 to 150 bucks just for this amount of epoxy. And the Unibond is much more affordable. It's still more expensive than this stuff. Personally, I prefer to use this Titebond when I'm making bends. If I don't need it to be too rigid, it may begin to lose its form just slightly. Not really that much, but more than you would with something like an epoxy. That form is going to be really rigid, but also it's not going to allow for any kind of spring back. So if it's a table leg or a chair leg and it's going to be something that's exposed to a little bit of weight against the curve, you see this is glued up with yellow glue. It can handle some of the flex because it was glued up with the yellow glue. That's not always a good thing though, because if you're making a piece that you don't want to have that kind of movement and flex and you need the rigidity of it, then you probably want to go with some kind of a chemical reaction glue. The reason why I end up using Titebond more than anything is when you're doing a lot of bends, I tend to blow through a lot of glue. I lean more towards the cheaper glue. It's also a lot easier to clean up. It's just water cleanup. You can just use a rag, and then you don't have to worry about the messiness With the epoxy, you need to be fully coated. It's also kind of toxic to breathe, so you probably want to wear a respirator when you're using it, have rubber gloves on, and you're probably like, well, why the hell would I even use the epoxy in the first place? Because again, maybe you need that rigidity. Yeah, there you have it. You'll have to decide what your choice is on the glue. Now, we need to talk about jigs and what the veneers are actually going to end up getting formed on. This is what my bend looks like right after it's been glued on the jig prior to me doing any of the cleanup. This is after you've made your stack of your bends. You'll take your stack of bends, I'll have applied all of the glue to these layers, and then it can sit on here and I can clamp it onto the jig and it will dry on that form and give me one of these. And that's what we end up with when we're doing a bend. So as you see here, I have two types of jigs. This is a 1-part jig and this is a 2-part jig. I will go into detail in another video on how to make your jigs, but first you need to determine whether you're making a 1-part jig or a 2-part jig, which one is worth your time basically. You can see this kind of craziness that I have going on to do this bend. There are clamps going all over the place. It's kind of messy and you have to get them at just the right distance in order to get the adequate pressure on a 1-part. So the reason why sometimes you'd want to only make a 1-part though is it's easier just to do 1/2 than it is to have to go in and make 2 halves of something, right? And also, if you're only making 1 or 2 bends and you only need a couple things, then this is fine. You can go ahead and just make a 1-part jig. If though you're doing where I'm actually going to end up needing about 40 of these bends for the piece I'm making, it's going to be much easier for me to get away with using the 2-part method. It goes a lot quicker when it comes to the actual glue up, getting the clamps on, and you only have to put clamps in 3 places for something this size. You use a lot less clamps, and the clamps are going to be at a total 90-degree angle. So let me pop one of these off so you can see what I mean by that. When I go and fit this clamp on, I don't have to worry about trying to fit it around a curve. It's just going to be vertical, right? So I'm not over here like going, oh my God, how am I dealing with this, right? But again, it's a lot more complicated than just doing your 1-part. So once you've determined which jig you're going to go with and what's worth your time, you need to begin to prep your area to do the bend. And there are going to be several things you're going to need to get ready for that prepping. One of the things are your clamps. These are these cheapy ones that you can get at Harbor Freight that work great for these size clamp jobs, but they're not anything I would use for really big jobs. I have some more expensive clamps for that. To prep a mold, as you can see here, I have this piece is actually already got the tape on. I've taped it up. So you want to take some clear packing tape and you want to adhere it to your piece. After you've taped up your jigs, the next thing you're going to want to do is you want to be working on a surface that either you can easily wipe up with glue, so something that's kind of like a shiny surface. And I have this old tabletop, and this is just handy. I like to do all of my glue ups on it because the glue doesn't stick to it, and also I can just wipe it down really quickly. If you don't have this type of setup, I would highly recommend you use like a plastic drop cloth. Don't get the thin stuff, it's a nightmare to work with. You want something that's at least 2 milliliters, and the reason why I recommend plastic is because again, it's a nice easy surface that you can just go ahead and use a rag to clean up. I know it's not eco-friendly, but if you keep reusing the plastic over and over again, you could probably get away with using a tarp. I would not recommend using paper or newspaper. I did used to use that in the very beginning. The problem with the paper and the newspaper is though, yes, it's easy to throw it out, but sometimes you end up with the newspaper getting stuck to the things. Okay, you're also going to need a rag that's just a damp rag, and then some painter's tape. And this is just so that when you have the area that you're going to do your gluing on, you can tape down your laminations to make it easier when you're spreading the glue. This is just a piece of plastic that I found you could use a plastic old card. Sign up for my credit card, and it comes with like fake credit cards in it. Those are great to use if they're the plastic kind. I'm just using it as a spreader. They also sell spreaders that you can buy, look like putty spreaders. They're a waste of money when you can just use your junk mail. You got your bends, and then I'll go ahead and tape this down just so you can see. We'll do the first one taped down, and I will do one without the tape. And let's go for the 1-part. So I'm going to get all of my clamps ready for the 1-part. Oh, that reminds me, this little guy I pulled off, on the 1-part, you actually need what's called a cull. What a cull is something for the clamp to sit on top of rather than you putting the clamp directly on top of the piece of your bend. All this is about 3 or 4 little extra pieces of veneer without the glue on it that I just put some of that clear packing tape on so that I can set it on top and that the pressure goes directly onto the cull rather than onto my bend, and that way I don't have to worry about any of the marring that you get from the clamp itself. Alright, so I'm just going to go in and go to it. This one's going to get a little crazy. Here we go. And this type bond 2 has about 15 minutes of open work time. That means that from the moment I start beginning to spread this glue, I've got only 15 minutes to get the clamps on before the glue seizes. There are other versions of this glue that you can get that have extended work time, but if you get extended work time glue, just know that that's going to take even longer to dry. So for me, this stuff is supposed to be clamped or ready to remove the clamps in 30 minutes. I usually still wait for 2 hours. So here's the part where you saw how easy that was to spread. However, here's the messy part trying to get in here. And then for that first one, I usually just flop it over and sandwich it face to face, and then I'll go in and just pick up my layers. So then take my rag here, and I'm going to take off as much glue from the surface of it as I can. This will save me on sanding later when I go in to do the cleanup. Alrighty, here we go. I'm going to start here on this flat. What you don't want to do, once I've started at one end, you want to stay on whatever end you've rolled and work your way down. You don't want to jump all over, because if I start here, then I'm not going to get even pressure here. I am alternating the direction of the clamp as well as the side that I'm putting it on. You get a more likely to get even pressure by alternating your clamp. And then sometimes these little spring clamps is handy to have a little bit of extra piece. I know I'm going to cut this off when I go to use it, but plopping this on here will at least keep the laminations nice and tight. Alright, that was the 1-part glue up. Let's move on to the 2-part glue up, and this time I am going to forego the tape. Oh! I'm gonna just throw some glue on that piece, smack it back on, and I will actually make sure I place it towards the bottom. It's kind of good this happened. So this is fixable. It's gonna be a little messy, but it's fixable. I'm gonna take some of this blue tape, put a piece on it over it to hold it down while it's in the bend. Alright, there you have it. 2-part versus 1-part bent lamination. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hoping to have much more to come. Thanks for watching. That's lunch. Let's go. Back it in, people. Let's go. Let's go. The wrong way. Whoa. 15 minutes till that glue seizes. 15 minutes. Yeah, this is why I get nothing done all day.